friends, my name is Marines and these are some of my most recently read books. I am attempting to read 30 books in the month of December. It is December 13th and I've read 8 books so far. So I'm a little bit behind pace, but also I have time off coming up for the holidays and this has been 8 books while I've been working. So I feel pretty proud of that, and it's also just like 8 books in a month is like a good month for me anyway, and we still got some time to go. So let's talk about the books that I've read. Right at the top, I have 2 books that I've read because I'm reading all of the finalists in the romance category for the Goodreads Choice Awards. I won't be reviewing them here because I'll be reviewing all of them and ranking them in their own video, and also one of them is a HarperCollins title. So I read Delilah Green Doesn't Care by Ashley Herring Blake, which I originally rated 3.5 stars but is maybe closer to a 3, and then Hook, Line, and Sinker by Tessa Bailey, and is also a HarperCollins title, so I won't be reviewing it while the HarperCollins union is on strike. I did post a TikTok review of it, but that was absolutely my mistake. I just had it listed under a different publisher sort of in my tracking because I made like a mental assumption and didn't double check. So I'll refrain from any additional reviews in the meantime. The other HarperCollins title that I read is The Change by Kirsten Miller. This is also a book of the month pick for me. It was an add-on. I have so many thoughts about this book. Like there are so many things that I could say and they will wait. They will hold, they will keep, I will remember my feelings. Okay, so that's 3 of the 8. Number 4 and number 5 were both rereads. I reread The Girl Who Fell Beneath Fairyland and Led the Revels There by Catherynne and Valente. I am rereading the entire Fairyland series, yes, again. But this time it is a buddy read with my friend Kara from Wild Book Garden, and we are dedicating a live show to each book in the series. And the entire project is about giving middle grade literature the same sort of consideration that you would give any other literature, and really just thinking about the elements here, the craft, the themes, and dissecting all of it. I am having a blast because this is one of my favorite series of all time, and I think it lends itself very well to this project because it is very symbolic and it's very layered. It's a fairy tale, so it's got a lot of different things going on, plus it's a rich cast of characters. The second book was actually our November pick, but we had the live show in December, so I read this all in one day, like leading up to the live show. This one is like a very close second for my favorite in the entire series. There's a line of continuity here that I really enjoy that comes over from the first book, and there's so much thematically about light and dark, but also about growing up, and specifically about like growing apart from your friends, or your friends heading off in different directions or having different adventures than yours. That just always absolutely breaks my heart in the most like wonderful, tender way, because I mean, I've been there. I think a lot of us have been there, where we start to see our friends grow apart from us, and I just love the way that it's handled and treated in the story. If I haven't sold you on reading this book yet, or the series, I absolutely understand why the ambling plot and sort of the flowery, earnest, really over descriptive sort of style isn't for everybody, but if any of that is in your wheelhouse, if you enjoy fairy tales at all, this series is just so delicious, and I love rereading it. I actually, last time I did 30 books in 31 days, I believe, I reread this series also, so like rereading this, I feel like I'm in a constant state of rereading this series, so yeah. I also reread The Near Witch by V.E. Schwab, which I read this year for a project. I'm doing a deep dive into all of V.E. Schwab's work, and I will be reviewing all of them, and I will be noting some patterns as I try to determine what it is about Schwab's work that does not work for me. But I'll also be looking at their portrayal of female characters, because I've had a lot of trouble with their female characters in the past, and some like not like other girls pick me energy that they have. So I started with The Near Witch, which was their debut, and I read it earlier this year and didn't immediately make a review as I was trying to figure out like how I was going to do this project, and promptly yeeted every detail of that book out of my brain. Like, immediately forgettable. It was so nothing. The book itself was so much nothing that like I just forgot it. So in order to do the review, I had to reread it. I say I had to, like I'm not doing this to myself. I did reread it, and I already have that standalone review, so you guys can check that out. I will give you the quick recap here, and that is that I didn't enjoy it very much either on first or second read. It actually was trying to go for something like Fairyland, where it was more about characters and atmosphere and like a fairy tale-esque vibe. Darker than Fairyland for sure, but still kind of that sort of atmosphere driven, character driven sort of work. And because of that, it didn't have a very strong plot core, but it failed for me because I felt like the characters were incredibly flat. There was absolutely no investment there for me. They didn't feel like interesting or well fleshed out characters. And then you had that weak plot on top of it that just brought it down to a really dull, a really boring reading experience. The pacing was terrible. It drags on forever through the beginning and the middle, and then the end is this sort of rush to this conclusion, and then like a happy, yeah, we did it, where it was like, what just happened? I felt like I spent 10 years in the beginning and middle of that book, and then like I blinked and it was over, which is not an enjoyable reading experience. There was a touch of Not Like Other Girls with the main character, not as bad as I've seen Schwab be. It was just really sort of, it was trying to be this exploration of like toxic masculinity with the men in the main character's life and her wanting to be different, but it didn't quite hit for me in that messaging because again, the characters were just very, very flat. Overall, not an enjoyable experience and not a great start to this project, and I would give this 1.5 out of 5 stars. And the final 3 books that I have read, I'm so happy about because they are 3 books that were on my physical TBR, and I am trying to cut down my physical TBR. Like, I need to cut down my physical TBR at any cost. Like, we're doing this. It is out of control once again. I'm pretty sure that at some point in 2023 you guys will see me go through my TBR once again because I just have too many books, and a lot of these books are books that I was like, I'm going to read that the last time that I did my big unhaul project in 2020, and I still haven't read it, and I'm no closer to reading it. So I feel like that is a good indication of like, maybe they didn't want to read this too much. I also have a lot of books that publishers have sent me over the years. I have multiple copies of books because publishers will send galleys and then they'll send finished copies, and like I need to and go through this. But I'm giving myself a little bit of time here to tackle some of these books on my TBR, getting to some things that were like highly anticipated for me that I really, really do just want to read, and like getting that off read and then going in and reevaluating what I want to read and don't. I keep indicating over here because this is actually where my TBR shelf is. You guys are propped on top of it. So I'm like looking at it. It's like mocking me as I'm making this video, but I did read 3. First up is Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. It is an adult book that is sort of at a crossroads between science fiction and literary fiction. It follows 2 timelines and multiple characters. So Edwin St. Andrew on Vancouver Island in 1812. Almost 500 years later, Olive Llewellyn on a moon colony, who has written a very successful book about a pandemic, and connecting the 2 of them is Gaspari Roberts, who is a detective who is investigating time anomalies, and what both of these and other characters have witnessed that connects them is indeed a time anomaly. So Emily St. John Mandel wrote Station 11, which was a pandemic book. It came out pre-COVID. I read that. I loved it. I love that book so much. And then she wrote The Glass Hotel, which came out I think in 2020, or I read it in 2020. And all of her books, these 3 books at least, are interconnected in ways. Like they share a universe and sometimes characters are shared as well, and they all have similar themes. So I read The Glass Hotel in 2020, and I had an experience where I could tell the book was good, but I just didn't have a good time reading it. I read it in like April of 2020, so like right in the thick of shutdowns and the pandemic. I think I had just been laid off from my job at that point. I was not in a headspace to read something sort of as layered as that book was, or that required sort of the attention that that book required. And so coming to Sea of Tranquility, it was just so wild to be like not that we're post-pandemic, right? But like on this side of everything that has happened with COVID-19, like this worked for me in a way that was so much better than 2020. I really appreciated this, but I think it's interesting because I can see why it wouldn't work for people. It's not sci-fi heavy enough, I think, to satisfy frequent sci-fi readers, but it's not literary fiction enough. It's almost like commercial literary fiction, and it really just sort of blends those two things in a light way. I enjoyed it a lot. I loved the coming together of those things. I love the way that we were weaving in and out of timelines. I don't think that this is like super deep, and there were, like, I think I highlighted like one quote. So there were things that like were really nice about the writing, but it isn't very showy writing. There weren't things that were like intricate or like flowery. It was very clean, smooth writing with very matter-of-fact observations. One of the things that this book is sort of asking is that if this is life, right? Pandemic, or if life is a simulation, or if life is fake, time isn't real, like any of those things, what else can we do but still live that life? And so that sort of matter of fact of like, this is it, this is what we have, this is what we're experiencing, that comes across in the storytelling as well in a way that super worked for me but might not work for others. I was like 4-star enjoying this all the way up into the end, and I loved the end. I really loved the end. I think because this was so matter of fact, like I wasn't worried about like guessing. I didn't even feel like, oh, what's going on? I was just like taking it at face value. And so when it does kind of all come together in the end and we do find out what's happening, it felt really satisfying to me in a way. It was very circular in a way that time is, in a way that like time manipulation can be. And so all of that came together really well for me. This just worked. This just worked for me. I totally get it if it didn't for others, but I had a great time. I gobbled it up. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I finished Out There by Kate Folk, and this is a collection of short stories. It's always difficult to summarize a collection of short stories because obviously each one is about something different, but it is described as having a focus on the weird and eerie forces that lurk beneath the surface of ordinary experience, which I feel like captures it. So it very much is about like everyday life and experiences. There's a lot of like dating and relationships in here, friendships as well, connections with other people, things that you would see in everyday life, but with a touch of weirdness, with a touch or like a sprinkle of like a Black Mirror sort of vibe. I found this absolutely fascinating. I really loved this. I loved the stories in this. I thought that they were each really well done. Like there were no stories that I was like, that was really weak. There were some standouts for me, of course, but nothing felt out of place. It was tight. It all came together. I love my favorite short story collections are ones that have like a strong theme. They don't feel too samey, but you can definitely see the thread that pulls them all together. And I love short stories that have open endings that leave you right on the cusp of something, but that open ending doesn't feel incomplete, but it invites you to think further into the story, right? It still feels like a complete story, but it left you somewhere where you're just like, oh, on the edge of like knowing the end, or on the edge, or like you want to know more, but you still got the full picture. And that is this collection. It was like perfect for me in terms of what I'm looking for in a collection. It was creeped out. I thought a lot. I loved what this said about sort of ordinary life and dating and relationships and forming connections with those like weird things that it inserted. For instance, a big running theme throughout this is the story of these things called blots, which are basically like AI, which were invented to be workers in sort of care facilities and things where like more empathy are needed, but they weren't adopted. And so all of these blots kind of got pulled into catfishing women. Like they're all over dating apps, and their whole goal is to like steal women's access and identity, and then they sort of evaporate. So like navigating dating and dating apps when all of these blots are just existing, like that was so interesting to me. And it's right at the beginning and comes back again in the last story, so it bookends this entire thing. And I would literally read just like an entire story or an entire other collection about blots. But that gives you like a taste of what's going on here in terms of like ordinary, uncanny, and I loved it. So I gave this 5 out of 5 stars, and I will be following Kate Folk from this point on because I want more. This reminded me some of like Karen Russell, but instead of like that sort of magic-y vibe that Karen Russell has, this has more like of a sci-fi vibe. I didn't read a ton of short story collections. I think this is only the second one I read this year, and I tried to read a handful, but if I was going to read any, I'm so glad that I picked this up. 5 out of 5 stars. And finally, I read Woman of Light by Fajardo-Anstine, which, speaking of short story collections, I read Fajardo-Anstine's short story collection and loved it a couple of years ago. So when this was a book of the month option, I picked it up because I wanted to see what came next from this author. And I really like this. I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars because I think that there were a few things that were a little bit missing from the story for me. I think the main thing that you need to know is that this is historical fiction. I saw it sometimes described as like magical realism, which it has a splash of, or like a multi-generational story, which it also has a splash of, but the bulk of this just feels like historical fiction to me. I love stories. I've talked about this already in the last few videos, but I do love stories that have a splash of magic or a splash of magical realism or fantasy, and it often is very symbolic in a story, and it acts that way here. Mainly, we're following a character named Luce in 1930s Denver. She is a tea leaf reader, and her brother is a snake charmer, and he is run out of town basically, and she is navigating life in a segregated Denver. But we are also getting pieces of her family history and the stories of her relations and ancestors. I really enjoyed reading from each of the characters that we got introduced to. In fact, like sometimes I wanted so much more from the characters from her family. I wanted them to gel together sometimes a little bit better and maybe have a little bit less of Luce's story and more of those other family stories, but that speaks to how interesting I thought that each of them were. The thing here that I think might be make it or break it is that by sort of necessity of the story, Luce is a pretty passive character. The whole thing is that she's like living in this place where she is surrounded by racism, right? She doesn't have the opportunities. We're seeing the way that her family is being choked out of opportunities. So she is by necessity in her own story pretty passive. But at the same time, she has this one thing where she can literally read tea leaves and she's having visions and predicting sort of a future and whatnot that is very powerful. But we see that in this story, in this place, in this time, that it doesn't in fact give her a lot of power. And I loved the balance of that, but you're also reading from a character that is very passive, which can be an unenjoyable experience, but I found that it worked here. This writing is also really interesting. It is descriptive, but it is also not showy. Like, it isn't very flowery. It is very straightforward and matter of fact. It captures a lot of like the feeling of oral tradition, like the way that somebody would tell you a story just kind of talking about it, like this happened, this happened, this happened. So I feel like that might also be a make it or break it thing for some people, but I found that it was immersive. And again, because this is a story that features so heavily on Indigenous culture and Latina identity, I found that capturing that sort of oral tradition flow really worked with the story overall. For our main character, there were two sort of love interests that she's caught between, and I found that this was a bit of a weaker part of the story because you're not, I don't think, supposed to feel good about either of these men. Like, they're good choices for her necessarily, but they were also flat enough that I didn't totally love seeing her kind of bounce back between those two men. I much more enjoyed the parts of the story that were about her family. I'm very curious to see how this one will sit in my memory and if it gets like better or worse or strength, like how long I will stay thinking about this story and these characters. Fajardo-Anstine is going to be one that I continue to pick up because I love what she's exploring. I love the way that she is telling Indigenous and Latina stories. I love her settings and her sort of matter-of-fact writing. So yes, a 3.5 out of 5 stars. As for what I have on tap, I started reading Reminders of Him by Colleen Hoover for the Goodreads thing, and I don't know, I feel like I just need to like binge it so I can get that over with. And I also have the next one, Every Summer After by Carly Fortune, out from the library. So I have those two that I can start reading and then prioritize on my physical TBR. TBR. As I've been saying forever, Kate Daniels 9 and 10. Maybe this weekend this will be like a binge on the couch, relax sort of weekend, and I can finish those up. Book Lovers by Emily Henry and Love on the Brain by Ali Hazelwood are also on the Goodreads finalists. So these are two that I'm reading for that project but are also on my physical TBR. The Fields by Erin Young is a book that I purchased earlier this year. I did start reading this at one point, but it's got like creepy cornfield murder vibes, so this is like a daylight time reading. But I do want to read it along with How to Be Eaten by Maria Alderman, because this is also a book that I bought like in store at Barnes & Noble, and you know, I just want to actually read some of the physical books that I bought this year. Then we have Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, which I also started reading and got 50 pages into. This is Book of the Month, physical TBR, and I'm actually going to be buddy reading this with Max from Well Done Books a little bit later this month. He mentioned that he hadn't read it yet and he wanted to before the end of the year, and I was like, bestie, I still have to read it too. So I'm excited to buddy read this with somebody, especially because I feel like this is such a messy cast of characters and plot that like being able to be like, are you seeing this with somebody, is going to motivate me to read it. And Bloodmarked by Tracy Dion, which is the house salt pick for the month of December. I really want to reread Legendborn before I read this, so I kind of have both of those up on my TBR. I don't know. I feel like I do have time. I can do it. I want to reread Legendborn and then get to Bloodmarked. That's it for me today. If you have read or would like to read any of the books that I mentioned or any of the books on my TBR, let's chat down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon.